Pause for a moment and imagine this. A group of settlers stands in the heat of Texas. Authorities are questioning newly discovered enslaved children. They expect broken English, maybe Spanish, maybe silence. The children speak perfect French. Not a few words, not a rough accent. Fluent, precise, confident. It stops everyone cold, because this is Texas, an English and Spanish-dominated land, a place shaped by rough borders, fast violence and survival. French is not supposed to live here, especially not in the mouths of enslaved children, and yet it keeps happening. Again and again. Different towns, different years, same result. Children with no formal schooling, no recorded education, no obvious connection to France, but their French is better than most educated adults of the time. That is when confusion turns into fear. Language is not accidental. You don't speak like this by chance. You don't master grammar, rhythm, and tone without being raised inside it. Language tells a story about who taught you, who shaped you, who controlled your earliest years. So when officials heard these children speak, they realized something disturbing. These kids were not random. They were not isolated cases. They were raised the same way. But how? And why? Texas was a crossroads of power. Spanish rule collapsed. French influence lingered in shadows. Anglo settlers pushed inward. Borders shifted faster than records could keep up. In that chaos, entire systems could hide in plain sight. What you are about to hear is not just a strange historical detail. It is evidence of a hidden structure, a method, a quiet pipeline that moved children, culture, and control across borders. This story matters because it breaks a comfortable myth. The myth that slavery erased identity completely. The myth that culture always dies under force. The myth that history is clean, simple, and fully recorded. These children prove something survived. Something was preserved on purpose. And the most unsettling part is this. Once authorities started noticing the pattern, the records began to fade. Names disappeared. Details blurred. Questions went unanswered. History does that when the truth is inconvenient. By the end of this video you will understand why French survived where it shouldn't have, who benefited from raising children this way, and why this pattern was quietly buried instead of explained. Stay with this story, because the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't an accident. It was design. Before we talk about the shock this caused, we have to understand what language really represents. Language is not just something you hear in passing. It is not picked up casually like a tune or a phrase. Language is shaped in childhood. It is formed in repetition, correction, and daily use. The way someone speaks tells you who raised them, who guided them, and what kind of structure surrounded their early life. Vocabulary, rhythm, and grammar reveal far more than people realize. They reveal upbringing. Before we talk about the French itself, we need to separate exposure from education. Exposure is hearing a language nearby. Education is being trained inside it. Exposure produces fragments. Education produces fluency. These children did not speak broken French. They did not hesitate. They did not mix languages. Their pronunciation was clean. Their sentence structure was consistent. They understood nuance. That level of command does not come from overhearing conversations or living near French speakers. It comes from being taught, corrected, and immersed day after day. Before we talk about how rare this was, it helps to understand how language develops in young minds. Children absorb rules unconsciously. They don't memorize grammar books. They internalize patterns through guided repetition. Someone listens. Someone corrects mistakes. Someone insists on clarity. Perfect French meant there was a system in place, a routine, a deliberate method. Someone cared deeply about how these children spoke, and that alone raised uncomfortable questions. Before we talk about why this mattered, consider what people believed at the time. Enslaved children were assumed to be uneducated by default. They were expected to speak only what was necessary for labor. Broken English, rough commands, nothing refined. Fluency was associated with privilege, not bondage. So when officials heard polished French, it shattered those assumptions. It suggested planning, investment, intent. Before we talk about reactions, we must acknowledge how threatening this was to established beliefs. Language is power. It allows negotiation. It allows secrecy. It allows connection across borders. A child who speaks perfect French can communicate with people others cannot. That made these children unpredictable. It forced authorities to confront the possibility that enslaved people were being prepared, not just controlled. Before we talk about consequences, notice how quickly the narrative shifted. The focus moved away from the children and toward dismissing the phenomenon. People searched for simple explanations, accidents, coincidences, anything but structure. Because accepting structured teaching meant accepting that enslaved children were shaped with purpose, intelligence, and long-term vision. And that idea was deeply unsettling to a system built on denial. Before we talk about the larger pattern, understand this moment as a crack in the story people told themselves. Language exposed what records tried to hide. It revealed that upbringing could exist even under oppression. It showed that identity could be preserved through discipline and routine. And it forced those in power to face a truth they were never ready to explain. Before we talk about how these children ended up where they were found, we have to understand the land itself. Texas was never stable in its identity. It was not born with a single language or a single flag. It was shaped by collision. Spanish rule came first, building missions and control through faith and force. French influence followed quietly, leaving traces more cultural than political. Then Anglo settlers arrived, bringing a new language, new laws, and a hunger for land. All of this happened in the same space, often at the same time. Before we talk about borders, it is important to realize how fragile they were. Lines on maps changed faster than communities could move. One year a town answered to Spain, the next it answered to Mexico. Then suddenly it was claimed by Anglo authority. People did not relocate every time power shifted. They stayed where they were, speaking the same language, practicing the same customs, and raising children the same way. Authority changed on paper, but life continued on the ground. Before we talk about control, consider how distance worked in that era. Texas was vast, roads were unreliable, communication was slow, enforcement was uneven. Entire settlements could exist far from the reach of officials. A language spoken in one valley might never be heard in the next. That made it easy for cultural pockets to survive unnoticed. What seemed impossible to outsiders was ordinary to those living inside it. Before we talk about hidden communities, we need to understand how power focused its attention. Authorities watched ports, cities, and trade routes. They cared about taxation, military threats, and open rebellion. They did not closely monitor households, farms, or isolated plantations. That blind spot mattered. Culture does not need permission to survive. It only needs routine. A shared language spoken at home could pass through generations without ever drawing attention. Before we talk about why French survived, remember that influence does not always look like dominance. French power in the region faded politically, but culturally it lingered. Intermarriage, religious ties, and trade connected people across borders. Language moved through kitchens, nurseries, and churches, not through official documents. Those spaces were invisible to record keepers, but central to daily life. Before we talk about discovery, recognize how easily outsiders misunderstood what they were seeing. To a new authority, a French-speaking child appeared out of place, but to a hidden community, that child was normal. The shock came not from the existence of French, but from the assumption that it should have vanished. That assumption ignored how slowly culture dies, especially when it is protected inside families. Before we talk about consequences, understand that Texas was less a single territory and more a layered landscape. Power stacked itself over older systems without fully replacing them. Beneath official rule, older languages, habits, and identities continued to function. In that layered world, entire ways of life could remain intact, waiting to be noticed only when they accidentally crossed into view. Before we talk about how these children appeared in Texas, we need to look beyond Texas itself. French colonial systems did not end neatly at political borders. They stretched outward into nearby regions through trade routes, religious networks, and private agreements. Even after French political control weakened, the systems they built continued to function quietly. Influence remained long after flags were lowered. Before we talk about movement, it is important to understand how colonial slavery actually operated. Enslaved families were not always moved openly or documented carefully. Transfers happened through sales, inheritances and informal exchanges. A child could cross from one territory to another without ever appearing in official ledgers. These movements were legal, semi-legal, or ignored entirely, depending on who was watching at the time. Before we talk about borders, remember that colonial boundaries were porous. Rivers, forests, and roads connected regions far more than governments admitted. A plantation on one side of a border often worked with suppliers, clergy, and merchants on the other. Enslaved people moved with those networks. They were sent where labor was needed, where language was useful, or where control could be maintained more easily. Before we talk about families, we must acknowledge how often they were fragmented. Children were separated from parents and placed into new households, but sometimes families were moved together, especially when specific skills were valued. Language was one of those skills. A French-speaking family could serve as translators, intermediaries, or cultural buffers in mixed territories. That made them valuable, not disposable. Before we talk about documentation, understand how fragile records were. Fires, floods, and conflict destroyed archives regularly. But erasure was not always accidental. When power changed hands, old records became inconvenient. New authorities did not always trust previous documentation. Names were altered, ages were estimated, origins were simplified. What did not fit the new narrative was often left out entirely. Before we talk about intention, consider how easily a child's past could disappear. An enslaved child arriving in Texas might be listed only by age and labor category. Language, upbringing, and origin were rarely considered important enough to record. Over time, those omissions became silence, silence became absence, and absence became official history. Before we talk about discovery, recognize how much had already been lost by the time questions were asked. The systems that moved these families were designed to be efficient, not transparent. They relied on discretion. Quiet movement reduced resistance and scrutiny. By the time authorities noticed a pattern, the paper trail had already thinned beyond recovery. Before we talk about why this matters, understand that history is shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. The altered and erased records were not random gaps. They were the byproduct of systems that benefited from obscurity. In that obscurity, language survived where names and dates did not. Before we talk about education, we need to let go of a comforting assumption. Not all enslavers wanted ignorance. Some wanted precision. They understood that a trained child could become a powerful tool. Skill created usefulness. Usefulness created leverage. And leverage, in their eyes, justified investment. Education was not offered as kindness. It was calculated. Before we talk about language specifically, consider how value was measured. An enslaved child who could only perform physical labor had one role. A child who could speak, translate, and negotiate had many. Language opened doors others could not enter. It allowed communication with traders, officials, and clergy. That made the child more valuable in markets that crossed cultural and linguistic lines. Before we talk about control, understand why language training mattered. Teaching a child a specific language shaped how they thought and responded. It controlled who they could speak to and what information they could access. Fluency did not mean freedom. It meant dependence on the system that taught it. The same hand that gave language could take away protection. That imbalance reinforced authority. Before we talk about intelligence, it is important to recognize how it was exploited. Enslavers noticed children who learned quickly. Those children were separated, trained, and positioned differently. Their education came with expectations. They were watched more closely, corrected more often, used more strategically. Knowledge did not elevate them, it bound them tighter. Before we talk about compassion, we must be clear about intent. Teaching language was not about self-expression or growth, it was about efficiency. A child who understood commands in multiple languages reduced misunderstandings. A child who could translate reduced conflict. A child who could explain orders to others became an extension of control. Education served the system first. Before we talk about outcomes, notice how this reframes the shock of fluent French. These children were not anomalies. They were products, carefully shaped to function in complex environments. Their upbringing was structured because structure produces predictable results. That predictability was valuable in unstable regions where power shifted often. Before we talk about morality, understand how this challenged public narratives. The idea that enslaved children were educated forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. It showed that intelligence was recognized, measured, and exploited. It exposed a system that understood the power of the mind while denying the humanity attached to it. Before we talk about resistance, remember that education cuts both ways. While it was intended for control, it also preserved culture. Language carried memory. It carried identity. Even when used strategically, it could not be fully contained. And that unintended consequence made the entire practice more dangerous to acknowledge. Before we talk about coincidence, we have to look closely at the details people noticed. It wasn't just the French itself, it was how the children spoke. Their manners were strikingly similar. The way they addressed adults, the way they waited to speak, the way they responded to correction. These were not random habits. They were learned behaviors, repeated and reinforced over time. Before we talk about accents, understand how difficult they are to replicate. Accent forms early. It settles into the muscles of the mouth and the rhythm of breath. You cannot fake it later in life. These children shared the same tone, the same cadence, the same pronunciation patterns. Not regional variations, not personal quirks, the same sound. That kind of uniformity pointed to a shared environment during their earliest years. Before we talk about vocabulary, notice what words they used. They did not rely on simplified phrases. Their language was structured. Their word choices were precise. They understood formal and informal speech. They knew when to soften a sentence and when to be direct. This kind of linguistic awareness comes from guidance, not chance. Someone taught them not just how to speak, but how to speak properly. Before we talk about patterns, consider how often this repeated. Different locations, different times, same result. The children recognized similar phrases. They understood the same expressions. They responded to the same instructions. This repetition removed the possibility of accident. It suggested a method that was reused, not improvised. Before we talk about upbringing, it becomes clear that this was not individual teaching by chance caregivers. It was consistent. That consistency requires planning. It requires agreement on standards, how to correct pronunciation, which words to emphasize, what behavior was acceptable. That level of alignment does not happen spontaneously across households. Before we talk about intention, ask who benefits from standardization. Systems do. When people are trained the same way, they become interchangeable, predictable, easier to manage, easier to deploy. A standardized upbringing meant these children could be placed into different environments and still perform the same roles. That is not nurture. That is design. Before we talk about organization, understand that informal systems can be just as structured as official ones. They rely on routine instead of paperwork, on memory instead of records, on tradition instead of law. The sameness among these children pointed to a shared framework passed quietly from one caretaker to another. Before we talk about disbelief, recognize why this idea was unsettling. It suggested coordination beneath the surface, a network that operated without oversight, a system that shaped minds while remaining invisible. And once that possibility entered the conversation, it became harder to pretend these children were simply exceptions. Before we talk about systems and organization, we have to talk about the people who made them function. Behind every fluent child was a voice they heard every day. In many cases that voice belonged to a woman. Enslaved or free black women fluent in French often held positions of care. They were nurses, caretakers, cooks and attendants. Their labor placed them close to children during the most important years of development. Before we talk about teaching, understand how caregiving works. Children learn language from the people who feed them, comfort them, and correct them. Not from formal lessons, but from constant presence. A caregiver speaks while dressing a child, calming them, guiding them. That repetition builds fluency naturally. When that caregiver speaks French, the child absorbs French as their first framework of understanding. Before we talk about authority, consider how invisible this process was. Care work was not viewed as education. It was dismissed as routine. No one recorded what was said in kitchens or nurseries. No one monitored bedtime stories or daily instructions. That invisibility allowed language to pass freely. Culture survived because it was woven into ordinary tasks. Before we talk about these women, it is important to recognize their knowledge. Many were multilingual by necessity. They navigated French, Spanish, and emerging English worlds. They understood tone, respect, and context. When they spoke to children, they did not simplify their language completely. They modeled clarity and precision. In doing so, they passed down more than words. They passed down structure. Before we talk about survival, notice how routine became resistance. Daily habits carried memory. Songs, prayers, phrases repeated without thought. Culture does not always survive through grand gestures. Sometimes it survives through consistency, through the same words spoken every morning, through corrections made gently but firmly. Before we talk about intention, remember that these women were not writing history books. They were preserving identity in motion. Their influence did not need permission. It operated in the spaces power ignored. The care of children was seen as low status, yet it shaped minds more deeply than formal authority ever could. Before we talk about recognition, understand why their role was overlooked. Records focused on owners, not caregivers, on transactions, not relationships. The impact of these women lived in accents, manners, and memory, not documents. That made their contribution easy to erase and hard to deny at the same time. Before we talk about legacy, see how culture moved quietly through hands and voices. It survived because it was useful, because it was lived daily, and because those who carried it understood that even under control, identity could still be taught. Before we talk about language, we have to look at religion. Catholic instruction provided more than spiritual guidance. It created a framework for teaching that could be repeated daily without raising suspicion. In a region where the church was respected and monitored, lessons in prayer, ritual, and scripture appeared normal. No one questioned children learning their prayers, singing hymns, or attending mass. Yet within these routines, something else was quietly happening. Fluency in French was being preserved and reinforced. Before we talk about repetition, consider how rituals work. Catholic practices are structured, predictable, and rhythmic. Children repeat the same prayers each day, memorize responses, and follow cues from adults. These routines created constant opportunities for language practice. Pronunciation, sentence structure, and vocabulary were absorbed without the child even realizing they were being trained. Learning became part of devotion, seamlessly integrated into daily life. Before we talk about community, notice how hymns played a role. Singing requires attention to tone, timing, and lyric. Hymns in French preserved pronunciation and accent across generations. Even when children were separated from French-speaking adults, the melodies carried the language. Songs became a bridge, connecting children to the culture of their caregivers and the broader French-speaking world, long after political influence had faded. Before we talk about secrecy, understand why religion provided cover. Education in other forms, grammar lessons, formal study, would have drawn attention. Teaching an enslaved child proper French outside religious instruction might have seemed suspicious or even threatening to authorities. But religion was considered acceptable, even commendable. The Church's framework allowed language to be taught openly while appearing to be purely spiritual training. This dual purpose made the instruction invisible to outsiders. Before we talk about discipline, remember that ritual also reinforced behavior. The Church emphasized repetition, attention, and obedience. Children learned not only prayers, but the structure and cadence of speech. Precision in language mirrored precision in ritual. The focus on correct recitation trained minds to listen carefully, repeat accurately, and internalize patterns, skills essential for mastering a language. Before we talk about resilience, notice how this method preserved culture under oppression. Even when children were moved from one household to another, the religious routine stayed consistent. The prayers, hymns, and ceremonies were portable, teaching the same French words, accents, and structures wherever they went. Religion created continuity in the face of displacement. Before we talk about impact,
recognized that what appeared as spiritual devotion was in effect a sophisticated teaching tool. It allowed caregivers to instill knowledge while keeping authority figures unaware. Faith became a vessel for culture, identity, and education, all protected by the respect and reverence surrounding Catholic practice. Before we talk about legacy, see how powerful this integration was. Language survived quietly, passed through sacred routines. Children spoke French fluently because it was inseparable from their spiritual life. Religion did not just guide their souls, it shaped their minds, preserved their heritage, and kept knowledge alive in plain sight. Over time, the records of these children began to fade. Papers were lost, names were altered, and details that didn't fit convenient narratives were quietly erased. What remained were fragments, scattered accounts of French-speaking enslaved children, barely enough to hint at the full story. Because of this, their lives rarely appear in textbooks, and their remarkable language skills are often forgotten in history lessons. But that silence was not accidental. The survival of their language, their culture, and their identity quietly challenged the official narratives. It revealed that enslaved children were not simply passive victims of circumstance. They were shaped, guided, and preserved in ways that disrupted the story those in power wanted to tell. Their fluency, their discipline, and their continuity threatened the convenient idea that oppression could erase humanity completely. This history reminds us that what is omitted can be as powerful as what is recorded. It shows that resilience, culture, and knowledge can survive even under extreme control, quietly passing from one generation to the next. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories and untold stories that reveal the truth behind the past.